Okay, morning everyone. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Welcome to the final installment of our four-part webinar series. Great to see some familiar faces back again. This morning we are going to talk through sort of how to go about setting sustainability goals and tracking your progress. As always, we're going to start with a bit of a recap on what we covered last week. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. But of course, as always, please feel free to drop some questions into the Q&A box as we go through the slides. So what we discussed last week was what do you typically need to disclose in your carbon emissions reporting, your sort of guiding principles, how often we should report and where to report. The main things that we need to remember when we are reporting on our emissions is one, disclose your emissions by scope and by category. So they should be broken out into your three scopes, that being scope one, what you burn in fossil fuels, scope two, what you buy from the grid and electricity, and scope three, anything beyond that. Typically, any sort of framework or any reporting body will ask for you to show the totals at scope level and then the totals at the individual categories. So be that your buildings heat, your buildings electricity, vehicles, and so on. As well as that, in terms of your actual emissions, you need to disclose the methodologies that you used in the calculations and also any assumptions that you used in the calculations. But they're quite easy to do so and they're usually contained in the back of the report. The sort of guiding principles that we've talked about sort of for the last number of weeks has always been transparency being number one. Similar to disclosing your assumptions or estimates that you've made, once you're transparent about where you've gotten your data from or how you've arrived at the end result of your calculation, you're fine. It's only becomes a problem when you try to hide it or slip it into the sort of T's and C's of any sort of report. As well as that, remember that the requirement to audit an emissions inventory is going to become more and more prevalent. I know CSRD is kind of up in the air at the moment. It is a mandatory part of that. It likely stay mandatory even after they make the changes to it. And it's quite likely that as we progress on towards 2030, the requirement to audit your emissions inventory will become increasingly more mandatory. Moving on to reporting frequency, we would at least encourage that you report on your emissions publicly, at least annually, internally, ideally quarterly. There's sort of, I suppose, some obvious reasons for it. One, identifying trends, being able to take action before it's too late and 12 months hasn't passed. But also it's something that consumers are looking at sort of ever more, where they're looking for that report at the end of the year or sort of 3 months into the new year to see, well, am I shopping with someone who's sustainable, or what steps are the business taking to try and improve on their carbon footprint? In terms of where to report, we'd be looking at doing so online, on your website, social media, LinkedIn, really anywhere that you have a publicly facing voice would be encouraging. Also, if you use any sort of Slack channels, Teams, or anything else whereby there's a company-wide channel, we'd encourage reporting of it there too, and even over email to the company and all the staff involved. So in terms of setting goals, what we need to probably first look at is why they matter. There's obviously the 2050 goals and there's 2030 goals, but even putting that aside just slightly for the moment, sustainability isn't obviously just good for the planet, it's good for long-term business. Customers are increasingly demanding eco-friendly products, eco-friendly practices, and as we've seen over the last while, there is increasing regulatory pressure. There's surveys and research out there whereby 46% of customers will say they're buying more sustainable products as a way to reduce their impact on the environment. With some customers even saying that they're actually willing to pay more for something that's sustainable. I think if you go online now and you're, say, doing a bit of an online shop, marathon running and half marathons are all the craze at the moment. If you're on Adidas or Nike, what you will see is the increasing prevalence of products that are made from sustainable materials being at the forefront of any of the sort of web pages that you would click onto. And they cost a couple of euros extra, but it gets that customer with a warm feeling that they're still having a positive impact. In terms of how to go about setting those goals and how to take actionable steps, We're going to run through that just now. So, aside from the obvious of having competitive advantage, whereby you're showing you, I suppose, put your money where your mouth is and that you're doing good for the planet, why and how do we set an effective goal? So, in line with the Science Based Target Initiative, so that would be the gold standard in terms of setting targets, looking to reduce on your emissions. There's a 2030 goal and a 2050 goal. So, there's two ways to approach this. If you're an SME and you meet the criteria, you can do their streamlined approach, which is quite quick and handy. It costs about $4,500 to submit and get verified on the standard route. It's significantly more expensive, but it shows that your business is at the forefront of trying to reduce emissions. So naturally, even though it's only 5 years away now, 2030 is your short-term target and 2050 is the long-term target. In an ideal world, your 2030 target will be to about half your emissions from your baseline year. So we know at this stage that your baseline year is just your first year of calculations. So whenever you've done that and you've set that in terms of trying to hit a 2030 target, it should be to, in an ideal world, half it. 2050 is the long-term target. That's seen as the latest point. You can bring that forward. Some people have brought it forward to 2040, others have brought it to 2045. It's whatever you think is feasible as a business. Any goals you set, similar to what we've said in the past before, they need to be feasible both financially and practically. So there's no point sort of going at this from an emotional point of view and saying this is what I'd like to do or what I think we should do. It has to be backed by the numbers. So you'll see there on the slides that I've said focus on emissions hotspots. So your goal should only really be set post calculations after you have the hard and fast figures that tell you exactly where your emissions energy or your emissions are being driven from. So if that's energy, that's where you should be targeting. If it's fuel, for example, that's where you should be targeting. I've touched on it there already. Ensure your goals are realistic. So obviously, trying to carve out budgets for this is not going to be easy. There's everyone within a business is looking for more money. Costs of everything are rising. So it has to be something within the target, within that goal that is actually feasible. Solar panels can be expensive. There is grants available for them, but then there's also the trade-off that potentially you might have to close down a facility or a site for a certain period of time so that the work can be completed. Whereas by switching provider with a simple phone call can be done with a small increase in cost, of course, per kilowatt, but with no change or impact to the business. Obviously, you need buy-in from all levels of the business. If you don't have buy-in from senior management, from those who run the business, it's going to be an uphill battle. So getting them on site first is going to ensure that you can make progress. And lastly, you need to think about if we've set 2030 goals and 2050 goals, they're sort of like, excuse me, the mission and the vision of the business. In order to achieve them, we need to have a number of little smaller goals along the way that will actually drive progress, drive a bit of momentum, and actually ensure we hit it. So if it's, for example, an energy goal and you haven't switched to LED lights, for example, or you maybe don't have smart meters in place, there'd be a couple of those smaller goals, smaller objectives that you'd look to hit along the way to ensuring you're operating at the most energy efficient way possible within the business. So as we move on there now to the next slide, identifying key areas for improvement. As we've mentioned, your goals should only be set post calculation. Once they're complete, there's no real point even discussing goals or targets until you've at least 75% of your emissions measured. Otherwise, it's sort of really just a bit of wasted time, unfortunately, and resources. You obviously need to focus on the hotspots. You need to look at how do we work with our suppliers and our vendors. So, for example, DPD in the UK are fully carbon neutral. So if you're a business that does a lot of courier shipping, anything like that, it can be looking at your vendors. In Ireland, when DPD ship in their HGVs, for example, they're powered by HVO fuel. And HVO fuel is a drop-in alternative for diesel. It can be bought at the pump in certain shops, but it has a 90% reduction in emissions. So if you're on this call now and you know you've a fleet of vehicles that operates and obviously consumes quite a lot of diesel, for example, you could look at getting HVO fuel instead. There's always simple solutions out there. That's what you need to focus on. It doesn't need to be some sort of world beater that captures, you know, great fame and acclaim straight off the bat. It's the small things that add up over time. And I suppose one thing we often find is when you've set those targets and you've set those goals, you will get a lot of momentum in the initial years with the low hanging fruit. And it's in the medium to the long term, whereby you need to look at how do we maintain this pace of progress? Because after you've hit those long term goals, or sorry, the low hanging fruit, it's a lot harder. It's going to require more investment. It's going to require, I suppose, a lot of conviction in what you're doing and that you're doing things right. So, having those short term objectives, having a sort of set plan in place to reduce is going to be crucial to maintaining that progress going forward. So, how do we go about actually doing this? What can we use to, I suppose, make your life easier in terms of tracking your progress and setting your goals? Tracking your progress, be it the progress of your emissions footprint or your progress towards your goals and your little objectives, is just as important. There are several digital tools out there similar to our own platform that have built-in calculators where you can quickly and easily measure your emissions progress, be it quarter over quarter or year over year. They'll also allow you to forecast and track whether you're on the right track. So if you remember there, I suppose, recommended several times to try and report quarterly on an internal basis. That software, such as the forecasting and so on, the trends, you'll be able to see if you're on track to hitting your 2030 or your 2050 targets, or if you've sort of slightly gone too far ahead in your emissions generation and you need to pull up your socks and do a bit of work and a bit of improvement to get back on track. If you obviously left it till the 12 months, it could be too late. And you'll have a big job, a big uphill battle to get yourself back to base, and it'll likely cost you more in the long run as well. Additionally, as a business, one of the biggest recommendations we can make is to define an intensity metric. The intensity metric is a measure that relates to greenhouse gases emissions to a specific unit of activity or economic value. In layman's terms, it's effectively a way of tracking your progress year over year, quarter over quarter. For most businesses, your intensity metric will be the amount of emissions produced per full-time employee or per euro of revenue generated, for example. But it's what should be drives the activity in the business. So obviously, I mentioned the fleet of vehicles there a few moments ago. If you are a courier or if you have, say, 50 vehicles on the road, it's more than likely the fuel consumption in those vehicles is what's going to drive the emissions in the business. In that case, your intensity metric would be related to the fuel consumption or the miles driven per year. And you would be looking at, well, how can we improve on that? Are we using HVO fuel? Are we using route planning in order to ensure that we're going as efficient as possible? For an SME, intensity metrics are often more meaningful than absolute emissions because they can show your improvements even as your business grows. If you're putting in place your little small objectives, you're hitting them, you're ticking them off, even if your business increases in popularity, you grow in size, you're doing more and more business, your intensity metric will fall if you're hitting off those targets. And it's important to update that progress regularly, identify the trends, keep all stakeholders up to date using your software. Whether it's a My Page feature or a little report that you share online, it allows people to see, okay, well, this business is continually working to strive and to improve on their emissions generation. So overcoming the common challenges of trying to set goals and targets, I suppose one thing we see a lot is after you've done your emissions baseline or even your second year worth of emissions calculations and you're looking at what can we actually do, there's sort of probably two common problems that people face first before they get into the budgets and sort of starting small is they're either a sort of office-based business where the footprint is small and say in a leased premises, so there's very little they can do, or their issue is that they don't really know where to start or how do we get even something measured? How do we get a reduction plan in place? Sort of post, say, low hanging fruit, you're going to face some challenges. It's obviously limited budgets, there's difficulty measuring your progress, or due to the nature of the business, sort of what I alluded to there, implementing meaningful change can be difficult because maybe you don't have control of the utility bills or so on. Start small. It doesn't always have to be the perfect solution. Don't let perfection get in the way of progress effectively. You can secure your leadership support, which is almost essential. If you have that, you'll be able to make that small progress. If you are in a leased premises, for example, and you don't have the utility bills, you can present information, say, to the landlord that'll show that for a small increase in kilowatt hour, this is going to be the saving in energy efficiency, for example, or this is going to be the improvement in carbon footprint. There's things like renewable energy credits where you're able to offset your emissions generation as a result of consuming electricity that's not from a renewable source. So there's always a workaround that we can do. There's even data out there that if you turn down the thermostat within, the room or the building by 1 degree, you could save potentially 275 kilos of CO2 over a year. So if you operate a large lease premises, for example, you can imagine what an impact that will have on your carbon footprint. 1 degree is not something most people are going to notice on a day-to-day basis or at all. When you're trying to address your scope 1 and 2 emissions, especially in cases where you don't own the premises, look, it's going to seem like an uphill battle. Um, but work with your landlords, the same as working with your vendors. Try to get even the actual consumption data, get the actual utility bills off them and get them to share that. That in its first step is a perfect initiative to allow you to know, okay, this is our 100% our footprint. We now have actual data. You can also, on most utility bills in Ireland and the UK, get what's known as the fuel mix. So you'll be surprised to see that, for example, if you're Pinergy or your energy, just how much renewable energy they're already feeding into the grid. Most kilowatts in Ireland are under sort of 350 to 400 grams of CO2 per kilowatt. But the average grid emission factor is slightly higher because it has to account for every business and every bit of electricity that's fed into the grid. So, how do we go about engaging leadership, engaging the stakeholders, and so on? Typically, the businesses that have the most amount of success have some form of a green team or a green committee that can really spearhead the initiatives, the goal setting in the business, and I suppose take accountability for the progress and the efforts that are being made. You need to obviously work with everyone within the business, whether it's getting them to fill out the survey for work from home and commute, or getting them to engage in the initiatives that you put in place to try and reduce the emissions. So you need to educate them on why we're doing this as a business, what are the benefits of it, and how does it benefit them as well. Humans and ourselves, we're quite simple creatures. If we think there's something in it for ourselves, it's often going to be the easiest motivator for us to do something about it. Share your progress with all the stakeholders, internally, externally, leadership level, and so on. When you have wins, whether they're small wins or big wins, you need to promote it. You need to keep momentum going and let people know that the efforts they're making, be it to turn off a light when they leave the room or say not charge the laptop all day long, only when it's needed. You need to show them the benefit that that's having, both for the local community where you work and also for themselves at home. If you can educate them on it, it's more than likely that they're going to take some of these habits home with them and even improve the carbon emissions in their home life as well. Sharing your progress can be easily done. You've got your Teams channels, you've got your Slack channels, you have your websites, your social media. The sort of My Page feature that we have is another great way to engage everyone, get a live look. It allows you to have a live emissions page, share all of your reports, your initiatives, and the status of them over a number of years. One thing I suppose we always finish on, guys, before we get to the sort of the Q&As really is how do we continuously improve? And in the case of setting targets, tracking the progress, it's kind of like a full circle approach. Excuse me. So if you take it that we've set our targets, you've measured your emissions, you set your targets. The first step is then implementation. You need to go about trying to see if you can make these work. What are the small objectives along the way to hit the big goals? And when you get to say your quarterly time reporting or your annual, review them, see what needs to be adjusted, see what you need to pivot to, and then set the goals again and keep going. For sort of reaching a 2030 target or a 2050 target, it's likely that your objectives along the way, the small ones, will change quite regularly. even as you tick them off. There will be adjustment in industry trends. So, like that, the move towards HVO fuel will become more common. It's going to spread out to more and more petrol stations around Ireland and the UK. The same way, if you look at any Amazon van that comes and drops off a parcel, it'll likely say that the van is powered from its electric vehicle, for example. Work with suppliers. You might be quite surprised by how good your suppliers are already. Shipping companies that I've mentioned several times are great. There's other small local businesses that are doing great work around reducing any waste, ensuring no waste goes to landfill and so on. And just regularly review it and update it as you see fit, based off the trends that you're seeing in your data. Um, that I suppose wraps us up in just in enough time for a sort of Q&A to finish on 11, or even potentially slightly before for the last one. If you do have any questions, guys, please feel free um, to document them there now. I'm just trying to access the Q&A button myself. No questions just yet, but I'm sure one or two might pop in anyways. Just while we're waiting there, guys, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to everyone who's attended over the last number of weeks. I hope it was really beneficial for you guys and that you got something out of it. If you'd like to discuss any of the points or the slides further, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We'd be delighted to have a conversation with you guys and hopefully help you on your carbon emissions journey. How do you report sustainable accounting standard metrics? Yeah, I'm not sure if you're still here, so I'll type out an answer as well. The sustainable accounting standard metrics are actually quite easy to report. Um, New accounting standards came out, ISS, I believe it's S1 and S2, not too long ago. So if you're trying to report on them, it'll actually be done via your financial accounts, whereby they ask you to disclose effectively and discuss the risks and opportunities as you see them from an ESG and a carbon accounting point of view. Um, but we'll follow up with some more, I suppose, information on that itself. It won't apply to every business, but it's something that even if you're a business who undertakes an audit every year, your auditors or your accountants who are preparing the end of year accounts should be able to advise on as well, as it's now under their remit there.